I think I've spoken before about this idea that when we try to understand knowledge, or when we try to construct epistemologies, we tend to use spatial references to discriminate one kind of knowing from another kind of knowing. And also we use the properties of space in order to distinguish, not only to distinguish, but also to place different values on different kinds of knowing and to allot different appropriate contexts for those types of knowing to take place. I think I've talked about that before. So, for example, I talked about horizontality, the distance from where the person is out into the world as one dimension, a spatial dimension, in which different kinds of knowing are kind of arrayed. So, information which is considered to be objective, or knowledge which is considered to be objective, is placed as an object to be placed out there in visual space, horizontally separate from the observation position, if you like. Whereas knowledge which is considered subjective is placed much closer, again in this horizontal dimension, perhaps so close as to be pressing up against the body, metaphorically speaking, or even inside the body, in which case we tend to talk about it in terms of things like taste or gut feelings or that kind of thing. And I think I've also talked about the vertical dimension, suggesting different distinctions within the understandings of knowing, which you find in, well, all different kinds of knowing, I think. You certainly find it within relatively conventional, fact-based knowing. So, for example, when Isaac Newton, I think it was, said that if I can see further than other men, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. I think he was quoting somebody else, but never mind. The idea there is that just as elevating oneself physically in space to a higher position allows one to see further, to see more objects out in horizontal space, so elevation in the vertical dimension, metaphorically speaking, would allow one to have a greater access to that kind of objective knowing. So it has a relevance in terms of that kind of distant objective knowing, but it also seems to play into other kinds of knowing. I'm not sure if subjective is the right term even, but knowings which are more closely allied to experience and phenomenology rather than science and objectivity. I think I've spoken before about Teilhard de Chardin's idea, or his developed metaphor about everything that rises converging, this sense that as one gains a metaphorically higher viewing position, gains the higher ground, not only does one have distanced access to the visible objects of objective knowledge, but also one has a kind of shared subjectivity, the convergent subjectivity. Not only is oneself rising and converging, everyone else is rising and converging, and so the whole it's so hard to understand this for myself. But I guess the individuality and idiosyncrasy that is associated with subjectivity and proximal knowledge is overstepped with Teilhard de Chardin's idea that as one rises in knowledge terms, one converges with other centres of knowing. And I think you also find that in Andrew Cohen, who I don't know a great deal of knowledge about, I have to say, but what I've read about him, I think it's interesting, for example, that he uses this term, the higher we. So he's suggesting a relationship between the intersubjective, the interpersonal, and this methodological elevated position. You also find it, I think, in Freud, in his use of sublimation. Sublimation in Freudian psychoanalysis is kind of the opposite of repression. In repression, you push unwanted desires, that's the unwanted knowledge, unwanted forms of knowing, carnal forms of knowing, you push them down. In sublimation you do the opposite, and you kind of sublime them upwards, so that the knowledge becomes upwards. One of the things he says about that, in terms of sublimation, is that it becomes a social act. One becomes more socially engaged. So the sublimatory activities of art, for example, or poetry, in Freudian terms, are social engines of creative endeavour, if you like. They're not idiosyncratic, entirely subjective activities. So again, you find it in that. You also find it in Kierkegaard, you also find it in St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. Again, there's this sense of an elevated sense of knowing in which the subjective becomes interpersonal. Now, I wasn't going to talk about that when I started this video, and I can't for the life of me remember what I was going to talk about. I think it was something to do with... Oh, I know what it was. Oh, God, I wondered what's the point. Never mind. What I was going to talk about was this, the term knowledge. It starts to become very difficult to use the term knowledge when you're talking about subjective understandings. And you find that, or at least I think you'll find that in the various taxonomies for different kinds of knowledge that you see. In, for example, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy that Aikoff and others formulated some years ago, which is used in business circles, I think, more than anywhere else. Data is considered to be this objective, in this horizontal plane. Data is considered to be this objective information that one accesses, and then information, and then knowledge, and then wisdom. And as one moves across that hierarchy from data to wisdom, there's a sense of it becoming more proximal, which would be idiosyncratic and would be subjective, except that, as the term suggests, it's a hierarchy, which means there's also this ascension, this idea that as one moves from data through information and knowledge towards wisdom, one is also gaining height with all of the intersubjective status, all of the convergent status, all of the social status, all of the higher we kind of status that wisdom acquires. But what also happens there, I think, is that the term knowledge, as I suggested, is also slightly problematic. Those tiny frogs jumping across the ground where I'm standing. I'm just going to see if I can capture one on film. Those tiny frogs. Very good. Anyway, back to the data, information, knowledge, wisdom. Oh yes, so as one approaches in those models the condition of the subject, albeit in personal, intersubjective kind of sense, and the higher sense, the term knowledge becomes problematic because it stops feeling like knowledge, really. It starts being a clear-cut, solid, well-bounded, separate, distinct entity, and starts to become coterminous with words like intelligence, or consciousness, or well, dispositional terms, or descriptors of what a person is, or how a person feels, or what a person is capable of, rather than the properties of a distinct object. So that's just more an observation than anything else. And again, you find that in Perkins' distinction between proactive, performative, and possessive. Possessive knowledge is out there with data as a kind of object that one can possess and gain hold of. But when you come closer towards the body of the subject, even in an intersubjective, elevated sense, the knowledge which Perkins calls proactive knowledge is dispositional. It does again become coterminous with terms like intelligence and consciousness, descriptive of what a person is.